Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, PIAM Physical Access Control on Steroids. Today's webinar is being presented by Bart Van Sevenen, the Chief Product and Technology Officer of RightCrowd. Before we start, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be recorded. We will be able to share the link with you after the event is complete. We welcome you to revisit the content and share it with your colleagues. We also invite you to comment or ask any questions. You can please add those to the Q&A chat box on the screen, and we will address those at the end of the webinar. At this time, I'm going to hand it over to Bart, who is going to start today's presentation. Bart, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Colleen, and welcome to this webinar, everyone. So this webinar is going to go about PIAM, which stands for Physical Identity and Access Management. So to get started, let's have a quick look at what we're going to go through from an agenda point of view. We will be talking quite a bit about the space of physical access control. So the first thing we'll do is look at what is a physical access control system and what are the challenges that come with deploying and running, operating physical access control systems. And that'll be a lead into the space of PIAM. And you'll understand as we go through those challenges why that sort of creates the need for physical identity and access management. After that, we're going to go through a number of use cases of PIAM, and there's many of them, but we'll focus on the four most common ones that we see out in the market across our customer base. And after that, we'll talk a little bit about return on investment, like, is it worth investing in a PIAM? What is the return, both from a financial perspective, but also from other angles? And then we'll end with a very short demonstration of PIAM. We don't have the time as part of this webinar to do an in-depth review or demonstration of all aspects of a PIAM solution. But what we will do as part of the demonstration is focus on what is the end user in an enterprise organization seeing when you deploy a PIAM. How do they sort of interact with a PIAM solution? So we'll touch on that as part of the demonstration, and then we'll do a wrap up, the benefits, and the Q&A session. So without any further ado, let's dive into the world of physical access control. And the fact that you're attending this webinar probably means that you have deployed a physical access control system and are potentially looking at PIAM as a potential solution. But the starting point for this is physical access control. Every single large enterprise in the world today has deployed some form of physical access control system. And many of you may be using some of the leading solutions in this space. You have companies like Lenel, you have companies like Honeywell, you have Genetec, you have Johnson Controls with their Secure 9000 system. So there's many large physical access control systems in the world. And if you look at the main goal of all of those systems is exactly the same. It is making sure that only the right people have access to your facilities, your buildings, your sites. Now, physical access control systems, if you look at the actual deployments out in the field, we do see a number of shortcomings or challenges with those systems. And those shortcomings are linked to two important sort of aspects of the deployment of physical access control systems. And I want to go into those into a bit more depth before we go into an actual example of one of our customers. The first issue that we see, or cause of issues, is the fact that physical access control systems are typically deployed as standalone, isolated systems. And if you think about the gist of what a physical access control system does, what you do is you input basically all of your employees, often also contractors, in some cases, visitors. So you enter those into your system. You also enter credentials, in a lot of cases, access badges, and then access levels, which are linked to doors or areas, depending on which physical access control system you use. And so what we see is that very often the physical access control system is implemented as an isolated system, which means that you are manually, or by means of imports in the form of an Excel sheet, as an example, that this information is entered manually into the system, and that maintaining the system, maintaining the identities that sit in the system, maintaining the credentials, the cards that people are using, is done in a manual way. At best, and we see some enterprises doing that, at best, there is some form of an integration with what you could call the authoritative sort of data source for identities, which in a lot of enterprises is either Active Directory or an HR system. So in some cases, we do see a link with that, but other than that, physical access control systems are implemented in an isolated way. And that does result in a lot of manual work. And we'll talk more about the problems that that causes. The second issue we see with physical access control systems in real life is the fact that they are used in a very static way. And what I mean by that is, in a physical access control system, you're going to enter people, identities, you're going to enter all of your employees. And then what we very often see is that you're then statically going to say this person, for example, John. John is part of the IT department. John is working out of the New York office. You're going to hard code basically the access that John has. You're going to say these are the buildings, and within that building, the doors that John, or the areas that John should have access to. It's entered into the physical access control system, and then it's not going to change until someone manually is going to make a change to that record. And that is problematic, because if you think about what an actual working situation looks like since the pandemic, a lot of companies have flexible working arrangements. People go in certain days of the week, but not every day. Organizations have scaled back some of their buildings. So you're talking about sharing spaces and a more flexible way of arranging who can get into the building one. So the question is, from a risk perspective, from a security perspective, do you still want a system whereby access is hard-coded in the physical access control system, versus do you want something that is much more flexible? And so if we tie this all back into an example, and the example that I'm going to go through is an example of a healthcare customer that RightCrowd has. And I have rounded off the numbers for the example here, but the healthcare company that we're talking about has about 25,000 employees. And what I summarize on this slide is a simple reflection of what happened in 2023, so last year, to that organization from an identity perspective. This company was just under 2,000 people that left the organization, people that were let go or left on their own. Then we had about 2,500 people that joined the organization, so new hires that entered the company. There was a sell-off of a subsidiary of approximately 500 employees. They also acquired a company, an small IT company that sort of joined their organization. And then about 800 people changed either location, they relocated, or they moved into a different role. And so this is what you could call a mid-sized sort of enterprise organization. But if you see and look at the amount of changes that happened in just 1 year, you have to think about what that means from a physical access control system. If your physical access control system is something isolated, not connected to anything else, and it is a static implementation, then that means that you have literally hundreds, in reality, thousands of changes that you need to make in this physical access control system in a manual way. And we all know when you change things in a manual way, you will make mistakes. And so that means that you're going to miss certain things, that certain things will be incorrectly inputted into that access control system. And that quickly leads to what we call access chaos. I give the example for just 1 year, but imagine if you would fast forward what happens with the content of this physical access control system after a period of 10 years. You will find plenty of records of people that are still in the access control system, were never removed, people that have access that they should no longer need. We call that access accumulation. And so what happens is that, first of all, the real reason why you purchase the physical access control system in the first place, making sure that only the right people have access, has basically disappeared. It's no longer really doing well what you sort of bought it for. And secondly, as a result of that, you have introduced additional risk, because you now have a lot of people that have access that they should no longer have. So that's, in summary, a number of the challenges that we see with physical access control systems. And that is a good lead into PIAM, because PIAM is going to try to address and solve those challenges. Now, before we go into explaining exactly what PIM is, I want to make a quick sidestep. I want to leave physical access control for a second here and look at an adjacent market that has gone through sort of a similar set of challenges and problems, and they have resolved that a while ago. And that is the space of logical or cybersecurity. If you look at how access control and identity and access control has been dealt with in the larger IT space, we've gone through a significant change over time. If you would go back in time and look at the 80s and 90s, when IT developed applications, what they did at that time is they built user management and access management straight into each application. So each IT application had their own users and what those users could do within that application. And you can imagine if you're a large enterprise and you have, let's say, 100 different IT applications, and you need to manage the users in each of those 100 applications, that becomes like a mission impossible. And that was led in the larger IT space to the creation of what is today known as the space of identity and access management. And that happened around the year 2000. That was when the first identity and access management solutions appeared in the market. And so what happened is that instead of maintaining users and their access rights within each IT application, with the advent of identity and access management solutions, a layer was put on top of those applications, and the user and access rights were pulled out of the application and put in this layer on top. So instead of having to maintain identities and access in every single underlying IT application, it was moved up one layer in a dedicated layer called identity and access management. And that is pretty much, if we go back to PIM, PIM is doing that exact same thing, but then in the space of physical access control. So you have probably at least one, in reality, likely more than one physical access control system. And so today, what you're trying to do is maintaining all of those users and their access rights in each of those physical access control systems. PIM is that smart layer on top of it. So imagine introducing a software layer that sits on top of one or more of your physical access control systems, and you see a list of them on the right-hand side of this slide. This layer is put on top of it. It integrates in both directions with those physical access control systems. And in turn, this PIM layer is integrating with IT systems, business systems on top of it. And with which systems is going to integrate with any system that is relevant to determine whether or not a person should have access to your facilities. So going through a couple of like real life examples of systems that a PIM system will typically integrate with. Let's start with the authoritative source for identities. That is in most organizations, either Active Directory or an HR system like Workday. Why is that? If you have new employees joining your organization tomorrow, the first system that those people are going to be put into is going to be that HR system. And then from there, in the Active Directory system. So the source of truth is that system. So PIM will integrate with that, will pull information from there. So as soon as a new employee will start, it will know that, it will pull that information from that system. A second example of a system that PIM will typically integrate with is something called learning management or training systems. Systems that keep track of all of your employees, sometimes also contractors, all of the courses, trainings that they went through, and if relevant, expiry dates related to each of those trainings and certifications. That again is something that is a system that is relevant in the context of physical access control. Why is that? In a lot of high sensitive areas, you're going to have certain policies in place that say for someone, and I'll take a real life example, data centers. In a lot of cases, for a person to be able to get into the data center, you expect them to have gone through certain security trainings. That is often mandated. Think of the ISO 27001 security standard that mandates that you have certain knowledge before you give access to those high sensitive areas. So a PIM system, if we start to pull the picture together, PIM system is going to pull information from those northbound IT and business systems, and it's then going to use that information to then dynamically change the content of the underlying physical access control systems. And what a PIM system is ultimately going to do is automate both your processes related to physical access control, as well as your policies and rules related to physical access. And so in our example, if a new employee starts next Monday, that information is going to be pulled from the HR system. And then based on your policies and your processes like workflows, it's going to be do the right thing. And we'll go into a bit more detail on that in a second and push that information down into the physical access control system. And the end goal of a PIM system is very simple. It's addressing the challenges that we went through, making sure that each and every physical access control system you have remains up to date. So it has the right identities in there. If people join, they'll be put into the system. If people leave, they'll be taken out of the system, and that they have the right access. And the right access is going to be determined in a much more dynamic way than your physical access control system would be able to implement if it's just a standalone system. So instead of saying, I hard code the access of someone by saying John has this access to the data center, a PIM system is going to make that much more dynamic. And in more technical terms, we refer to that as attributes-based access control. Instead of that hard coding example that I gave, it's going to look at a number of attributes. For example, what is the location of the person? What are the trainings that they went through? And it can be other attributes as well. And so instead of saying John has access to the data center, which is what you would do today in physical access control system, we're going to create rules that are going to determine who can access the data center. So in my example, we're going to say people that are part of the IT organization, that is information we derive from HR, that are based in this location in the US or in Belgium or wherever it may be, and that went through those trainings and the trainings have not expired, those people will have access to the data center. And I hope you can see the big difference. Instead of depending on a manual task where you put someone into the system and make sure that you also remove them whenever it's needed, you now have a system in place that dynamically sets and revokes access. So that's, in a nutshell, what PIM, Physical Identity and Access Management, is all about. And what we're going to do next is go through a couple of the typical use cases of PIM and compare the two scenarios. What if you do not have a PIM solution in place, so you only have a physical access control system, versus the scenario where you have implemented a PIM system on top of your physical access control system. And we're going to start with the most common scenario that every enterprise is faced with every single day. That is the process of onboarding, offboarding. People join the organization, people leave the organization. If we start with our scenario where we have a physical access control system but no PIM, what happens there is, in the most optimistic scenario, we have some integration with a system like Active Directory or HR, and it's going to feed into the system. But now that record arrived in the physical access control system, but now we have to make sure that that person gets an access badge or a mobile credential, that the right access is being set for that person. And that, in reality, if you only have a physical access control system, comes with a lot of manual work. We still see either emails being sent from the HR system to the physical security team with instructions, hey, this person starts next week. Can you make sure a badge is being prepared for that person? Can you make sure that they have access to this or this building? And a manual process kicks in. In some cases, there's forms that are being used to fill out those forms, but then those forms still are sort of manually translated into the physical access control system. That is okay if you have 100 employees, maybe if you have 1,000 employees, but if your organization has 30,000, 50,000, a couple of 100,000 of employees, that becomes truly a mission impossible. And you're going to have lots of mistakes being made, or delays are going to get caused, and then people do not have the right access that they're entitled to. So if we compare that scenario with now putting a PIM system in place, that PIM system is going to completely automate this process. So let's start with the onboarding. New employee starts. every night or every couple of hours, we pull in the latest information from the HR system. We see that a new employee starts or will start soon. A record is being created in one or more physical access control systems. A workflow is kicked off to say, hey, this person will need a badge or a mobile credential. A workflow starts. If you want to, and that can be optional, the manager of that new person will need to approve that. A badge will be, or a workflow is kicked off to make sure that a badge is issued, printed. The right access is going to be determined, and that can be based on rules. You can say, given that this new person is going to be part of the sales department and the person is based in, let's say, the state of New York, we automatically assign physical access to the building in New York. So all of that is fully automated. Same thing for the offboarding, and probably more important from a risk perspective. If someone is either let go or leaves the organization, that is typically a moment of high risk. From an insider threat perspective, that is the most dangerous point in time from a life cycle perspective. So it is very important that as soon as that person is leaving the organization or the announcement is made that the person will be leaving, that immediately the right access is being revoked for that person. With a PIM solution, that again is going to be fully automated. So it's not going to depend on any manual processes. An important additional thing that comes with a PIM solution is the fact that everything that happens in what I just described is kept in an audit trail. So that onboarding example or that offboarding, you will have an exact audit trail of what happened exactly on what day at what time. So if you have an audit and the auditor asks, like, can you show me what happened, how much time it took for physical access to be removed from a person that was let go last month, you'll have the full audit trail of that in your PIM solution. So let's move to the next use case that we see being implemented in PIM pretty much all the time. It is the example of access requests. Access, physical access, is something that is dynamic, and any organization that is present in multiple locations, that is an international or multinational company, will be familiar with the following scenario. Myself, I'm based in Belgium. My badge gives me access to the Belgian office that we have at RightCrowd, but I travel quite a bit. So if I want to go to, for example, our Australian office or an office in North America, I want my badge to work in that location for the time that I will be there. Is it a good idea from a risk perspective to make it such that my badge works in any office at any time? No, probably not, because the vast majority of the time, my badge should not give me access to those locations from a risk perspective. But when I travel for a meeting, for example, I would like my badge to work there. So starting again with our scenario where we only have a physical access control system, what then happens is that we see emails being sent back and forth, like, hey, I'm going to travel next week to New York. Can you ensure that my badge is going to work in that location? That email is going to be sent, for example, to my manager or to the security officer. That person is then going to, if it's the security officer, he's going to want my boss to approve that. Then he is going to send that to the area owner, the person in charge of that New York office from a security perspective, to then make those changes in the physical access control system. Manual tasks. Guess what's going to happen at the end of that week is my access going to be revoked. In best case scenario, yes, but it's again going to depend on manual actions. If we compare this again with having a PIM solution, this picture changes completely. With a PIM solution, I'm going to have access to a self-service portal. Me being an employee, I log into the portal using SSO. I simply go into a form that says request additional access. I would like to have access to this location from then till then, submit. Behind the scenes, a lot of things can kick in. I can have automated rules that are going to check whether I'm allowed to go there, whether there's any additional attributes that we need to check in the background. It may kick in a workflow, so it will automatically notify my manager. My manager will be asked, hey, are you okay with Bart traveling and getting access to that office for the next week? Yes or no? From there, it's automatically going to then notify the person in charge of security for that location. The person is going to approve it. And then guess what? At the end of my week in New York, my access is automatically going to be revoked. And again, I'm going to have a full audit trail. If that auditor says, why did Bart have access to the New York office in that particular week? You can show exactly what happened. Bart requested that access on that date, was approved by his boss on that date, was approved by that area owner on that date, and it was revoked by the system automatically on the last day of his visit. So that's access requests. Let's move to the next use case for PIM, visitor management. And this may be one where you're a bit surprised, like what about visitor management? Like visitor management is like a thing on its own. Like, isn't there like a whole range of visitor management solutions out there? Like, what does this have to do with PIM? Well, there's a good reason why visitor management is an important use case of PIM. We do see a lot of organizations that either still use manual logbooks for visitor management, or that have purchased a standalone visitor management solution, a solution that simply automates the visitor management component of it. But if you take 2 steps back, what are we trying to do in physical security? We're trying to protect access to our locations. We want to make sure that only the right people have access to our buildings. But there's more. There's also things like safety. If at some point we need to evacuate a building, we want to know who's in our building. And when I say who's in our building, that includes our employees, our contractors, our vendors, but also our visitors. Visitors are also people that are present in our building at a certain point in time. So why would you try to manage visitors separate from employees and contractors? From a PIM point of view, physical identity and access management point of view, we look across all people that will ever require access to your facilities. So all of your employees, your contractors, your vendors, your visitors, doesn't really matter. Of course, there's going to be functionality that is specific to visitors. You're going to be able to pre-register visitors. You're going to be able to then enter them or register when they come on site. PIM solutions or modules for visitor management also include everything you would expect, like kiosks where they can self-register, or when they have been pre-registered, where they arrive with their QR code, scan themselves in, and they get access to it. But the beauty of a PIM solution is that in the backend, we have one central database, one system in which we know at any point in time who has access, including our visitors. And again, same thing from an audit trail perspective. In your central PIM system, you will also know everything that happened from a visitor perspective, when visitors were pre-registered, when they arrived, when their host picked them up, when they left the premises, and so on. And the last use case I want to briefly touch on is one that is less security focused, but more focused on health and safety. And in a number of industries, this is a very, very important one. RightCrowd started about 20 years ago in mining. That was like the first industry that we focused on. In mining, health and safety is extremely important, but there's many other industries, manufacturing, oil and gas, and there's many more where health and safety is very important. And the interesting thing about physical security is that you can use your physical access control system to enforce health and safety rules. And the beauty again of PIM is that we can leverage and automate health and safety rules through PIM. And I will go back to sort of that mining industry where we started so many years ago. In mining, health and safety are, as I mentioned, extremely important. For someone to be able to enter a mining site, you have a whole range of conditions that need to be met. There are very strict rules around the amount of time that people can work in a mining site. You cannot work more than so many hours a day, more than so many hours a week, so many hours a month. That's very important. There's medical checks that need to happen. There's drug and alcohol tests that are often conducted on a random basis. There's additional training and certifications that need to be in place before you can get to certain parts of the mines. And so what you can do with PIM is you can pull information from different systems where that information is stored, a training system, a medical system, whatever it may be. And this PIM system is going to check that all of those policies and rules that you have are respected. And when they are respected, access will be granted. But when some of those rules are breached or something is missing, then the access is automatically going to be revoked. And on top of that, you can make it very proactive. You can warn people in advance, like, you cannot come to the mining site today because you're missing, for example, this certification or this medical check has expired. So this is another example of what PIM can do. It can help automate policies and rules that you, from a company perspective, want to enforce from a security, from a health, from a safety, or for a compliance perspective, and enforce that through physical access control by having rules and workflows in your PIM layer that enforce those. So that brings us to an overview of the type of product modules that typically come with a PIM solution. In this case, I'm talking specifically about the RightCrowd PIM solution. Our solution is called RightCrowd's Smart Access. And so what this PIM solution does, it truly automates that entire physical access lifecycle that we touched on. Very specifically, when you buy RightCrowd Smart Access, you get the base, what we call PIM module. So that comes with that engine that is able to integrate with one or more physical access control systems that can tie into all of those business systems that we mentioned. That comes with a rules engine that allows you to automate all the policies. That comes with a workflow engine that automates all of those processes and workflows. And then on top of that base PIM modules, we have different functional modules that you can plug into them depending on your exact needs. Do you want to, and I gave that example, do you want to automate the self-service site for your employees, where employees themselves can go into a very intuitive portal, invite visitors, request additional access, request a new badge and the like? That's the employee access module. If you have an organization where there's a lot of contractors that are in the mix and you want to push the management of all of those contractors to the contracting companies you work with, we have a module for that. There's a visitor access module that we touched on. There's one specifically for health and safety. There's one related to what we call access attestation or recertification, where on a regular basis, you're going to reevaluate, does that person still need that physical access to those sensitive areas? And there's more modules. So that's a quick overview of RightCrowd's Smart Access. And that brings us to an ROI calculation, because we often get questions about that, like, this is most likely an investment. So can you help us justify the investment in a PIM solution as part of an investment cycle? And I've picked one very specific example, but just in full transparency, we have an ROI model. We're happy to share that with you if you would be interested in that. And what I did, I simply ran a specific scenario through our model, and this is sort of the output of it. In my example here, I went with a company that has 37,500 employees. They have an annual personnel turnover of 29%. So 29% of personnel throughout a period of 1 year will disappear and others will join the organization. And then we go through a number of assumptions. And those assumptions are not random. Those are based on facts, based on conversations with our customers. If you look at the average amount of time that is spent on onboarding or offboarding an employee when you use manual processes, the average is about 20 minutes. If you look at the average amount of time spent on making a change to a personnel record in a physical access control system, that can be a role change that triggers a change in the access they have, that is an average of 5 minutes. And if you then apply on top of that an average hourly rate of $47, and again, we have the model behind this, so if you want to change some of those numbers, you can do that. You then come, in this example, to an annual operational cost of maintaining that physical access control system just based on the changes that I mentioned of $412,000, a significant cost. If in this scenario, you would look at what would be a typical sort of market rate or a license cost for a PIM solution, that is approximately 300,000 US dollars for a company of this size. So you can see an annual sort of saving of a little over 100,000 US dollars in this specific scenario. Now, one thing I do want to highlight is this is simply saying from a pure financial perspective, what does a PIM solution give you? From my personal point of view, the operational cost saving is just one small element. The real value from my vantage point is the reduction in risk. You have invested significant dollars in putting physical access control in place. You want to make sure that that physical access control system is working properly, that it is only allowing the right people on at your premises at any point in time. And that is exactly what a PIM solution does. It will ensure that only the right people can get into your facilities. So it's literally giving you that assurance, and that's the true big value of PIM. So with that, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into a short demonstration of what a PIM solution looks like. And as I mentioned in my introduction, what I'm going to do is show you what a PIM solution looks like from an end user perspective. So let's go back to the example we just gave as part of the ROI calculation. You're an organization with 37,500 employees. What if I'm one of those employees in that company and I want to do certain things in the context of physical access control? I want, as an example, to be able to request additional access because I'm going to travel to a certain location, or I would want to invite a visitor, two of the use cases that we went through. The interface we're looking at right now is what we call our employee application. So this is the interface that either an individual contributor or a manager in your organization would be looking at. This interface is different from the interface that a person that is part of the physical security or safety team would be looking at. For those users, the power users, as we call them, we have a much more extensive interface where you can do a lot of the configuration, those rules, those workflows, etc., that I mentioned. But this is the interface that either an individual contributor, an employee would look at, or a manager in your organization. In this very specific example, I'm a manager. So I have a team that works for me. And so when I log into this employee application, what I can first see on the first page is just a summary of a number of things, tasks that I have, visitor coming up, access, etc. I have a second step here where I can see a number of tasks that I need to do, things that I need to approve being a manager. My next application here is related to access. So if I want to apply for additional access, I can simply request additional access. I can say I want additional access for one of the people working for my team or part of my team. I could also request access for myself for another sort of location. So I can say, let's take Mehmet as an example. Mehmet is going to travel. Sorry for that typo. I can then say, I'm going to add access, and Mehmet is going to travel to our corporate headquarters, so he needs access to the executive office. I can give it a starting date, like he's going to travel next week, so from the 20th until the 24th, or 20th, sorry, until the 24th, and I can simply submit. From an end user perspective, this was super simple. I just filed this request. I can see that it's now pending. Behind the scenes, a lot may happen. I may have either an automated rule that kicks in that checks based on sort of where this person wants access to and who that person is. I may immediately automatically approve that, or it may be a whole workflow that kicks in where someone needs to approve, then another person needs to approve, and so on. But from an end user perspective, it is very simple and intuitive. The same for visitors. I may say, hey, I want to invite a visitor. I can say, I invite this person from then till then, certain location. I want to pick a certain host for that visit. I can say which is the visit type. Is it escorted, unescorted? A reason for that visit. I can invite visitors, and if I already know them, I can simply select them. If it's a visitor that has never been here, I can add new visit. And of course, given that this is completely integrated with the underlying physical access control system, I can link a physical access and access control level to this visit. So that's an example of visits. And by the way, all of the sort of fields that you can see here on the screen, those are dynamically generated. So depending on, for example, the visit location, or depending on your organization, you may want more or less fields. Those are all dynamically generated in the background. If we switch to this last one here, I did mention the word attributes a number of times, things like trainings, contracts that are in place, NDAs, safety videos, whatever it may be. At RightCrowd, we call that competencies, things that you may need, require for physical access. If I click on this tab here in this dashboard, I can see that there's 2 competencies that I have as part of my record, and I can see that one of them has been expired. So that again, this system allows you to really open up that information, and in this case, warn the person like, hey, be careful, your first aid has expired, and that is something that may be required for certain physical access. And if that would be the case, and I would request that access, it would basically flag that to me and say, be careful, you're not going to be granted that access until you have renewed this first aid training. So that was a quick snapshot of this visitor application. And this is just, as I mentioned, one part of a PIM solution. So let's wrap up the webinar, and then we'll go into a short Q&A here. If I summarize the benefits of a PIM solution, there's of course the reduction in cost because of the fact that we are automating a lot of manual tasks. There's secondly the fact that we are enforcing all sorts of policies, security policies, but also safety policies, health policies, compliance policies, etc. And from an audit perspective, everything you do from a physical access control perspective is kept in an audit trail. So in view of an internal or an external audit, you have a full proof of everything that happened. So in a nutshell, you've invested in physical access control. Your PIM solution is going to get the most out of it. It's going to make sure that the information in your physical access control system or systems is kept up to date, and that the access that is granted or revoked is being done in a dynamic and a correct way. So with that, we'll wrap up and open it up for Q&A. Just for those who are not familiar with RightCrowd, we have been in the space of physical access control for a little over 20 years. April 1st, 20 years ago was the start date of RightCrowd. We are a leader in this space of physical identity and access management, and we have plenty of customers around the globe, including many Fortune 50 customers for whom we automate all of those physical access control processes and policies that are part of a PIM solution. So with that, let's go into any questions that we may have received.
Sure, thanks, Bart. We did receive a question. What size organization is best for this type of software?
That's a good question. And the simple answer to that, Colleen, is that the larger the organization, the more employees you have, the more benefit you will get from a PIM solution. My personal recommendation would be if you have like 1,000 employees, do you need a PIM solution? Probably not. There can be an exception if you have a lot of high secure areas, you may still want to look at PIM more from an audit perspective and enforcement perspective. But the more employees you have, and at a high level, we say as of 10,000 employees is probably a good sort of starting point. As of that point, it becomes a very hard problem to do this in a manual way, and you will run into a lot of like errors and human errors being made. So I would say as of 5,000 to 10,000 employees up, investing in a PIM is a good thing.
Great. If anybody on the call has other additional questions, you can always add them to the Q&A part. If not, we will end this webinar for today. And you can reach out to Right Crowd if you have additional questions after the fact by going to our website and hitting our contact us. Actually, we have one more question that came in. How do you get to market? Do you sell end users or integrators?
Yeah. Good question. Historically, in the early days of PIM, there was a lot of like us working directly with the end customers, selling it directly to them. But over the more recent years, PIM has become more known in the industry. And the reality is that most large enterprises do have typically a security integrator with whom they work, who has installed their physical access control system. And we typically try to work through those parties because they already know those enterprises, they know the physical access control system, they know the challenges that exist within those organizations.
Great, thank you. All right, that concludes our webinar for today. We appreciate everyone's time and thank you, Bart.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.